Alrighty, so by popular demand, and by popular demand, I'm exaggerating because it was like maybe 10 people. Um, I'm having a discussion slash half debate with Ben Burgis here, and I guess so. We don't have a firm structure here at all, so we'll kind of just play it by ear.
Yeah.
Um, but in terms of the actual premise for this discussion, tell me if I'm crazy.
Yeah.
Okay, so I got a message from this person who purports to be somebody who organizes debates of some kind. I didn't know much about this individual. Remind me of the name of the person.
Lance.
Okay, I didn't even know his first name. And apparently, he's offering to facilitate or moderate a debate, which, okay, fine. And to me, debate means something different than just one of these casual YouTube conversations, which I'm perfectly willing to have. But the way it was presented was that it was going to be a debate. So you had some kind of disagreement with me that you wanted to formally debate.
Mm-hmm.
As formally you can accomplish in the context of a YouTube stream. And then it kind of evolves into like I have to individually come up with a debate proposition, and then people were like mad at me that I was saying that he should have come up with a proposition if he's going to be proposing a debate. Like, wouldn't you expect that if somebody comes to you and says, "Hey, I have a proposal," this guy, I thought, wants to debate you. My expectation would be, okay, here's a proposition, so then you could prepare somewhat. You could get data or statistics if you have if you need them, so you can be equipped to conduct an actual debate. So, like, where did I go wrong here?
Yeah, I think there was just some miscommunication, maybe. So Lance hosts a channel called The Serfs, and I have done some debates like what you're talking about with like opening statements and all that stuff there. And I think I was doing them there fairly regularly for a while, and I think he was just kind of trying to line things up. And he said, "Oh, how about Mike Tracey?" And I said, "Well, I'm not against doing that, but about what?" Right? And then like I think maybe at some point in his conversation with you, me, and any parallel conversation with you, something got lost there. But
it was just weird that the onus somehow got placed on me to come up with the debate proposition. I'm not the one who came up with the idea for a debate, so why is that onus on me, right?
Yeah, and I'm not. I'm not either. I think his intentions were fine, but we're good, right? I like Lance, but it's not. But I think that, and some of that might be my fault, right? Because I think at the time the conversation I had with him was like I just described, and then he sort of like brought up a few possibilities even, and I think I kind of shot them down because I was like, well, those sound a little slippery to me. Like I'm not, what all I mean by that is like I'm not really sure that there's like a clearly defined issue of clear disagreement there. And then I think more recently, I think because somebody on Twitter brought it up, and so probably made you think of it, and so he told me Michael was wondering whatever happened to that. And
I just recalled that was sort of an outstanding thing, and I just messaged him to say, "Hey, did anything come of this, or like, what's the status?"
I said the same thing I said before. Okay, fine, but about what? And then like I think
but it just seems like if his whole
yeah.
premise is that I'm going to be facilitating debates and I'm going to moderate them, then like if I were doing that, I would feel it was within my purview to then come up with a proposition and put it to the various participants to see if they could come to an agreement, and then you would facilitate it. Because if we're just going to have a freewheeling discussion, we don't need a moderator.
Sure. Yeah, I think probably he or I or somebody. Anyway, it doesn't matter.
All right. Well, that guy screwed up. That's my initial debate premise.
Okay, all right.
But we don't have to dwell on that because we just spent 5 minutes.
I think
debating about a debate, which we don't need to do.
Communications happen on Twitter. It's fine. But
yeah.
When we were possibly going to do some sort of debate, right? you'd mentioned a few articles that you'd written. They were all kind of about the like post-game analysis of the election, basically.
Or
And
the Democratic primary
yeah,
campaign, the Bernie campaign in particular.
Yep. And so I guess one thing, now that we're sort of freed from trying to come up with like a really
we can move on. We can embrace the ambiguous nature of this discussion at this point.
Sure, fair enough, right? So the one in American Affairs, the Angela Nagel, I thought might be an interesting jumping off point since part of your analysis there was about Bernie Sanders' failure to sort of embrace patriotic language and imagery, and maybe even some like different policy positions.
Sorry if you get annoyed that I interject, but just as a point of clarification, it wasn't so much about his failure, although that's a component. It was about the impossibility of a wholehearted embrace of that kind of imagery or rhetoric as a result of the contingencies of the left activist movement of which he is a part in a way, or which of which he is the tribune, at least in an electoral context.
Okay, so I mean, I think that the part that I maybe agree with is that it's certainly true that there are people on the left who are willing to sort of accuse people of being fascists over not very consequential disagreements, and
I would have guessed that. That's definitely never happened in my experience. So you'll have to enlighten me as to what happens when that occurs.
Sure, fair enough, but
people have accused me of, on the down low, trying to formulate some kind of red brown crypto fascist political movement. Well, like they think that I'm powerful enough that I could single-handedly, maybe in concert with Angela and a couple others, found like some kind of political formation that is red brown, meaning or Strasserite or any of these kind of obscure terms that you have to like Wikipedia to really understand, even on a superficial level, because they've just kind of come into popular currency, at least on these online left discussion in the past couple of years, in the since like the dawn of the Trump age, so to say.
Yeah, I mean, I was recently accused of that exact same thing and those exact same words because I'd written an article for Jacobin about the lockdown protests, where in the first 3/4 of the article, I said all kinds of very negative and harsh things about the protests and the groups that organized them. But in the last section, I said that some of the people at the protest were, even people who are members of unsavory organizations were articulating legitimate economic grievances that the left needed to have better answers for. That if somebody's worried, or for the sake of argument is pretending to be worried, a lot of people wanted to really argue about whether the person was being sincere, and I really don't care about that, right? But if people are articulating worries about being able to make rent and car payments and things like that, then I think that's something we need to be speaking to directly, precisely because I do think that the shelter-in-place orders are necessary. But if it drags on for too long without more economic relief for ordinary people, then I think that this sort of reaction you're seeing to the lockdown protests is going to become more popular with a wider base of the population. So we really need to be speaking to that. And the title of the piece was "The Left Can't Just Dismiss the Anti-Lockdown Protests." And I think there were about like 300 people on Twitter. To be fair, I don't know if this is being fair or not, about 99% of them clearly only read the headline. And
the headline, I understand why the headline was worded that way, but just given your distillation of the argument there, I could see how the headline maybe doesn't quite reflect the thrust of the piece, because the lockdown protests themselves seem to be populated by people whose grievances may be expressed in a certain fashion, but at least my impression is that people who are failing to make the rent are not going out to these relatively minor protests. They have like other kind of cultural grievances, and you saw it. It's kind of a shadow of the Tea Party in a way, but this is on a much smaller scale.
I think that's true. Although also, I mean, I think the Tea Party analogy is kind of instructive because a lot of people at the time correctly said that a lot of that was astroturfed, but it did turn out that they were speaking to something that had a wider audience, which you saw in the next congressional elections, kind of after.
Like something can be astroturfed, but in the process of the astroturfing, amplify sentiments that are authentic, right? Like just because the organizational muscle that went behind facilitating the protests is, funded by some kind of billionaire group. Every individual person who's a participant is not necessarily astroturfed, if that makes sense.
For sure. And also, of course, the fact that you have like billionaire funding doesn't mean you need to worry less about it. In some ways, it actually means you need to worry more about it because, you have this big megaphone and, you could reach more people.
The Tea Party was pretty darn influential.
Yeah, and look, I don't. I think that there's a lot of obviously ridiculous sort of right-wing culture war grievance going on at those protests, but there were people there who were, again, maybe cynically, right? I don't know, right? But like,
I almost hesitate. I mean, I'm sorry to keep interrupting, but I almost hesitate to make any firm judgments about the composition of those protests because I have never attended one myself. I haven't spoken to the people there. And just from a journalistic perspective, I know that that's often necessary to really have a holistic understanding of stuff like that. And like when you just kind of observe snippets of protests on Twitter and, sometimes it's very much incomplete in there. So I've just like to a mostly reserved judgment on them just because I can't give anybody a firsthand perspective.
No, that's fair, right? And so anyway, look, usually the defense is the author doesn't come up with the title. In this case, I actually did suggest the title because I thought that you
shouldn't reveal that because it's such a convenient excuse.
I know I'm taking away my own excuse here, but look, I thought that can't dismiss was a fair way of summing up. Should be worried about, should try to think about ways to counter, shouldn't just brush off, as a sideshow. But anyway, I'll do the self-criticism there. But there were lots of people, Matt Iglesias, Joshua Holland for The Nation, and also about, a couple hundred people.
I don't agree with Matthew Iglesias on a lot of stuff, but at least he's perceptive in his own way. But Joshua Holland is just like an embittered troll. I mean, he's horrible. Anyway, go on.
Yeah. So anyway, they, was accused of things from falling for AstroTurf, even though like literally that was in the second paragraph of the article, to Iglesias sort of insinuated this with screenshots and doing that like shrug emoji. But there were like probably, at least like dozens of people with like the rose emoji.
Anyway, so the bottom line is like in seeming to grant some degree of credence to the legitimacy of these protests, that was construed as you endorsing a red-brown alliance.
Yeah, exactly. So the fact that people are this quick to make that sort of accusation is clearly a sign of some kind of pathology in the left. No doubt about that, right?
Right.
But then I guess the part that I'm more curious about is like, okay, so if the sort of argument of the piece or this part of the argument is that it's bad that like Sanders couldn't have maybe taken different positions on immigration because he would have had that reaction, right? Then, I mean, to the extent that it's just it's just an attempt to just sort of like call the balls and strikes of the electoral analysis, like not like to make any sort of normative statement, just to say like, I think this is how it would have played out, right? Then, then I think that I'm still not sure how much that would have mattered. I could see how that could have like not taking the sort of abolish ICE, decriminalize border crossings position could have, perhaps been a liability in the general election. I'm less convinced about the Democratic primary that was part of what was going on there. But I think an even more interesting question would be sort of stepping aside from the issue of whether whether this would have had this reaction, or even like whether it's bad that would have had the reaction. I guess the part that I'm a little bit more curious about, right, is do you think these are actually bad positions to take, not just electorally disadvantaged, but like unwise positions to take, but like these, because if we have the same.
Well, I mean, just to stop you for a second,
yeah.
As you rightly alluded to, the article, which is long, and it's hard to make a concise.
Sure, if you could
summary of it, which I probably should figure out a way to do as like an elevator pitch type thing. But it's almost entirely descriptive rather than prescriptive. Like you might disagree with some of the descriptive assessments. That's fine, but don't misperceive it as necessarily prescriptive. But on the other hand, if like you then want to set the descriptive nature of it aside and ask above and beyond the article, do you think X, Y, and Z in a normative sense? Then I guess that's fair. But the task that we sought to accomplish in the piece was an almost entirely descriptive one.
Yeah, which is why I was trying to make that distinction, and that's what I was going to say, because I think the reason that's interesting to me, right, is because even the conversation about like what went wrong, in the primary, is different depending on whether we share all the same goals, right? So in other words, like, if you're talking about, again, I know this wasn't the focus of the article, right? But like, if you're talking about people who all start from the premise that it's both true that like Medicare for all would be a good thing, and that a more humane, less restrictive immigration policy would be a good thing, then you can have a conversation about what the trade-offs are. Is it worth giving up on some of those goals for the sake of others if we really are in a position electorally where we have to make that trade-off? But it's a completely different conversation if we don't necessarily have the same goals. If like, maybe we agree on the Medicare for all part, but like, even aside from
to simplify, you could say that the shared goal is the success of the Bernie campaign. Like that could be on the top of the goal pyramid.
Sure.
And just for the purposes of evaluating, quote unquote, what went wrong in a little electoral sense, I think it's useful to use that as a prism.
Yeah, no, fair enough.
Or the framing device, because then if you have like normative discussions about every single issue under that umbrella, I feel like you can get derailed. And that's kind of like why it was okay. The left failed here in terms of their electoral goal. Then let's be descriptive in terms of what gave rise to that failure, or what its proximate causes were.
Sure, and I'm definitely
the left's goal. I mean, I think you would agree was this, at least in the short term, the nomination of Bernie Sanders as the Democratic Party.
Sure, of course, right. Although obviously the reason we're that we have that goal isn't that we're so attached to having a president who sounds like some elderly relatives of mine, but because we think that he would then push for policy agenda.
Well, I mean that's interesting. I mean, Bernie, and this is, and I'm assuming we're just going to go on 1,000 tangents, which is fine. But like, I think a lot of Bernie supporters sort of took pride in it only being about policy in terms of why they were so vehement in their support of Bernie. But while I do think that's true to a large extent, I think it does miss the emotional, or it obscures, or maybe elides the emotional attachment that Bernie supporters had to Bernie himself, given his perceived candor and consistency, given the validation socially and culturally they derive from the Bernie movement writ large and the various components of that movement, whether it's like the DSA, whether it's some like the online communities that were formed to support Bernie. So I think there were dimensions of the Bernie support base that were contingent in a way on Bernie himself in the specific kind of quote unquote moment, as the, that you could, I guess, it's almost like it was like a 5-year experiment, which began in 2015 and ended in 2020. So like when people kind of say, "Oh, it's only about the policy for us," like I don't buy that. I think probably more so than other candidates, it was more policy oriented for a lot of Bernie supporters, but there were more intangible aspects to the quality of the Bernie support that maybe get short shrift if you just say, "Oh, it was just this cold policy analysis. We didn't care about anything else."
Okay, sure. I think that, look, I'm sure that both in general, and I don't even doubt in my own case, everybody has, none of us are purely rational about this stuff. We all have all sorts of, emotional and complicated investments and attachments, to things that get entangled in that, right? But to the extent that we're talking about, like you mentioned, the DSA, right, as like a political strategy that might make some sense on its own terms, was being invested in the Bernie campaign. Putting aside the question of how motivations get tangled together in people's minds, right? Then that's
complicated subject.
Yeah, sure, of course, right? Then that gets then that is because we care about policy outcomes, and we thought, right, that Bernie Sanders was at least the best shot, right, that we had there, and if one of the outcomes that we care about, right, that is one of the reasons we care about Bernie, is because of something like Medicare for All, and another, maybe it might be some of these positions on things like immigration. Then if it turns out that we decide let's just take it as an assumption that we've all read your and Nagel's article, and we're all persuaded by the descriptive analysis, which I have some more mixed feelings about, but I also think that one of the reasons that I wasn't eager to debate this is I'm not a journalist in the sense that you are. I'm not, this is not what I spend most of my time thinking about. But if we do just take that as a given that we're persuaded by that, right, then the question is, right, okay, well, what are the sort of trade-offs, right? If you lose a few votes because of this, right, is it still important enough to you to roll the dice and try anyway? You can see how that conversation can go from there. But again, that depends on whether you actually have all those goals, right?
Well, it also depends how you're defining the goal. If the goal is in the domain of immigration, then that's almost a cluster of issues that you could theoretically separate out, where you have abolish ICE, which became sort of a slogan unto itself, and then seemed to get cast aside as the primary war on, and some of its leading proponents, I don't know, maybe had second thoughts about it, or at least were no longer quite as vigorous and vocal in advocating it. So that's a specific policy initiative potentially, whereas sort of you characterized it in broad terms as a more humane immigration policy. So I think it is worth being precise in locating what this goal is necessarily that would factor into whatever kind of analysis of trade-offs you're suggesting would be necessary.
You mentioned two really specific ones in the American Affairs article. One of them was abolishing ICE, which, granted, I think different people. I think there's some ambiguity around the edges there, because you could technically just say, well, we should reinstitute the INS, right? We just shouldn't have ICE in its current form. But I think certainly, when I talk about that, right, what I would mean is, we don't need to have a domestic police agency that is specifically tasked with rounding up otherwise nonviolent people, nonviolent people, otherwise law-abiding people, who have in the past crossed the border, which used to be a civil matter, which until the 90s, which takes us to the second issue you mentioned, which was decriminalized boarding crossings, which wouldn't, of course, mean that there were no more there were no more border checkpoints. Anybody could come over. Everything was completely open. It would just mean that we went back to the system that we had for something like 95% of American history, which is up until the 90s and really in practice up until the Trump administration in a lot of ways. The sort of standard thing in most cases, even after the laws changed in the 90s to make it a criminal matter, was that people would just be kind of rounded up. I guess the Obama administration, some of this started to change, that they'd actually prosecute people before deporting them, but that you just sort of be rounded up and dumped off on the other side of the border rather than going through the detention and this criminal process. Granted, that's not the focus of your article, but just out of curiosity, what is your position on those two issues?
Well, immigration policy is not a focus of mine necessarily. So in discussing or in referencing those two issues, I didn't think it was necessarily incumbent on me or her. Angela's a little more immersed in that subject.
I read what she thinks about them.
Yeah. Which is just to say that we were referencing those two issues as examples of Trump-era preoccupations or fixations on the part of the activist left, which I think you would agree those became, especially the abolish ICE thing, and that was a significant kind of discursive component of the Democratic primary, at least in the early phase. Again, weirdly, it seemed to fall off toward the end. It wasn't like the candidates were really discussing abolish ICE in January or something of this year. It was more in the early phase for whatever reason. Mm-hmm. So my issue with abolish ICE in particular was that it seemed a sloganeering or branding exercise. It seemed like, it fit nicely into tweets and hashtags, and it didn't seem to me coupled with really a structural analysis of what that would entail. Because like you said, you could imagine abolishing ICE and then the administrative state just comes up with a replacement for ICE that maybe is a little bit nicer seeming. And that's probably what would happen given sort of inertial quality of the American the American administrative state and the law enforcement apparatus, at least as it relates to immigration issues.
Given that, right? So I mean, look, I think there's something to be said.
Because if that's your firmly if like one of your main reasons for supporting Bernie, right, or supporting any kind of left-wing project is a more humane immigration policy, then I think it doesn't serve you well to then reduce that to this, I would say, rather cheap sloganeering exercise.
Well,
which to me often seem to dovetail in my discussions with advocates of the abolish ICE position with a belief that borders themselves were inherently fascistic and should be abolished.
Okay.
In a sense, an open borders tight position. And like when you would talk about So a lot of people on the left get really offended when you say that there are strains of left thought which advocate border abolitionism or open borders of some kind. They say no one thinks that. I mean, that's a straw man that the right wing invents. And yet, so I heard that constantly. And on the other hand, I would constantly get people arguing to me, often rather aggressively and emotionally, that it's fascistic to support any border controls whatsoever. And it just seemed like this new moral totem had been erected in the Trump era that just presupposed border abolition or extreme skepticism, let's say, to be slightly more charitable, to the concept of border control whatsoever as the only righteous position, where most nation states that currently exist don't function with an open border protocol, right? I mean, so you're going to, and Bernie Sanders wasn't an advocate of that. And yet there was an increasingly dominant strain of left-wing thoughts, which held that as a position, and that got manifest as the abolish ICE tagline, into which a whole set of notions about the inherent evilness or depredatory kind of quality of borders were sort of bundled, and that to me was a source of frustration. I think part of the reason why it ended up kind of falling off the radar is because there wasn't a whole lot of thought really put into sussing out the true implications of what they were advocating that kind of took the form of this abolish ICE.
Okay, well, let's know that. So I do think there's something to be said for being able to sum up complex political positions in short, memorable phrases. If because most people aren't going to read policy papers, but sure. Granted that there's some ambiguity, some people might have meant more things about it, but like, how about this?
Do you also grant what I just said about this increasingly ascendant strain of left-wing thought, which is reflexively hostile to the very notion of border control? Is that like an extant phenomenon? At least to the extent that it's worth talking about, and like,
I mean, I don't. No, I know people who think that we shouldn't have like quotas, for example, on immigration. If anybody I know takes the position that you should literally have like no border controls, in the sense that like we shouldn't, we should abolish not only ICE but the border patrol. There should be no checkpoints to see who you are, what you're bringing into the country, etc. Then
or having like some kind of law enforcement entity deputized to police national boundaries is itself either fascistic or wrong or something.
Well, ICE doesn't exist to police national boundaries. It exists to round up people.
No, it doesn't. But I'm saying the abolish ICE slogan seemed to me entangled with suspicion, hostility, etc., toward the very concept of national borders having merit, or because it seemed like in chanting abolish ICE, what people were saying in effect was border controls are themselves wrong.
Okay. Well, when I don't know if I ever chanted it, but when I said it,
if you want to start a chant right now, feel free.
I'll pass. I certainly wasn't indicating that all border patrols of any kind are bad, right? I think I just gave a couple examples of very legitimate kinds of border controls. But what I meant.
Wait, what's an example of a legitimate kind of border control?
What I just said, checking to see who people are, what they're bringing into the country. Okay. Somebody's a weapons smuggler, right? Like, I mean, this is not a bold position, right? But that there are those do seem.
So you're saying national boundaries and efforts to police borders between nation states are not themselves inherently oppressive.
I don't think national boundaries are oppressive. I don't even think having border checks are oppressive. What I do think is oppressive and bad is having an agency, especially a very militarized agency like ICE, but even a hypothetical, kind of gentler one, whose purview is taking people who are already in the country, who aren't breaking other laws, who are nonviolent people, and rounding them up for having violated national boundaries in the past. I think there's not any reason that we couldn't do without that.
I think the script, the reason why we mentioned that in service of making a descriptive point, or in bolstering our descriptive thesis, was that the Abolish ICE slogan came to take on a connotation of, I think, reflexive hostility toward the very notion of border controls or boundaries between nation states to begin with. And that is politically deleterious toward forging a mass political coalition when you're using that as sort of like one of the central components of the left-wing program you're presenting to the public. So we could have a longer discussion about whether militarized police agencies such as ICE are justifiable. I think is perfectly legitimate. But we were more talking about it from something like what gets emphasized within the kind of constellation of left-wing priorities that are being presented to the public, and in this cycle took the form primarily of the Bernie campaign. And I think given some of the left-wing pathologies and tendency toward histrionics and utilization of some like dubious tactics where, again, they're kind of propagating a sense that to be in favor of any border controls, whatever, is reflective of some kind of latent or even overt fascistic tendency, contributed to a climate where certain kind of like elements of the Bernie coalition from 2016, for example, were pushed away.
Okay, so on so let's assume that all that's true. Do you have a view on the normative question, or are you just not sure what you think?
On the normative question of
should there be an agency like ICE?
Like ICE, or a less overtly hostile version of ICE.
Yeah.
I'm agnostic. I mean, I feel like when people point to excesses of ICE enforcement, I'm generally sympathetic. So, like early morning raids of meat packing factories and such stuff like that, where otherwise law-abiding persons who aren't violent necessarily or haven't committed any other obviously kind of like predatory offense upon another person are then kind of, so to say, rounded up. I am averse to that when I see that. Theoretically, is there a humane version of ICE where, as a national priority, we could say that like we want to get people at least to have documentation? Maybe it doesn't require deportation. But I think having some agency which is tasked with monitoring or regulating in some way the presence of people who enter the country through non-legal channels, to me, isn't inherently wrong or evil. But again, the devil's in the details there, because if it's inevitably going to get militarized, if it's inevitably going to take on features of like a overweening surveillance state, then I don't know. But that sort of gets to why I was suspicious of just abolish ICE as a concept in particular, because I just know that given the nature of the American administrative state and the law enforcement apparatus, even if you abolished ICE, other facets of the federal government are going to take on ICE-style responsibilities or tasks. So unless you get to like a more structural and well-reasoned view of the propriety of that kind of enforcement to begin with, then abolish ICE just seemed to me almost fruitless.
Okay. So I mean, I guess.
But again, it's not like the beating heart of my political
No, I
identity, right? So like, and I don't think everybody's required to have like a voracious, vociferous opinion on every single discrete policy issue.
Yeah, no, look, I mean, I don't, I mean, I'm perfectly fine with, I mean, if you just don't, just didn't have a view, right? I mean, fine, whatever. Not everybody has a view on everything, but since, but since it did come up, the article, and there does seem to be like a difference, maybe not in the context of an article like that.
Here's what I have a definitive view on. I have a definitive view on border controls and national boundaries not being inherently fascistic, and I know you share that view. Yeah. It comes down to how that is enforced and whether it can be done in a humane way and whether it gives rise to like domestic policing functions. But my problem is that in the oversimplified abolish ICE style of left-wing presentation, all of that seemed to get kind of muddled together into this very new tendency toward pure border abolitionism or hostility to the concept of border controls whatsoever. And I can tell you from direct experience, there were people who have kind of left-wing media personalities and that sort of thing who would concede to me that yes, they did think that border controls were inherently fascistic or at the very least highly undesirable, and that was what led them to be staunch advocates of this abolish ICE position. Okay,
well, I mean, look, I certainly don't make any secrets of this. When at the DSA convention last year, I wasn't a participant, but I saw that there was a resolution. I don't even know if it passed, right?
But it did pass. It did pass.
Okay,
there's where they adopted they adopted an explicit call for open borders. So using that exact term, which kind of undermines this idea that it's solely a right-wing caricature to say that aspects of the American left are in favor of open borders if the DSA is explicitly endorsing it at their national convention.
I don't think it's a right-wing caricature maybe to say that the DSA does. It's certainly a right-wing caricature to say, well, certainly many right-wingers will say things like the Democrats advocate this. That's obviously true.
But the DSA, I mean, I think, I don't know how much weight you give to their sentence as a political force in the past couple of years, but they were a pretty important part of the Bernie coalition. In the early primary states, they formed. There were huge amounts of volunteers, phone bankers, and that kind of thing who were DSA affiliated. So, I mean, I think you got to assign at least some weight to their presence within the left-wing activism world, right? And that had interface with electoral politics in this cycle.
Sure. I mean, look, I don't, and to put my cards on the table, right? I mean, I'm not a terribly active one, right? But I'm a member of DSA. I think it's a good thing. I have some criticisms, and I have, and when I'm not sure, I don't remember that phrase. I'm not saying, so I don't know. Maybe there were multiple resolutions, but I'd seen something that was like.
It was that. I mean, I checked. I mean, because we put it in the article, it was definitely passed.
What I remember was that it said. It said something that that used some phrase like national borders as a negative, and I remember at the time tweeting, please don't make me embarrassed to be a member of this organization by passing it.
And I'll just I'll just pull it up now just so we can be clear. But go ahead.
But so that's not my position. But what my position is that it's. Is that there's absolutely no reason why border crossings couldn't or shouldn't be treated in the pre-1990s way.
Okay, sorry to interrupt, but here's the precise language of the resolution that was passed again at the DSA National Convention in August of 2019. Yep. Quote, be it resolved that DSA supports the demand for open borders. Be it resolved that DSA supports the uninhibited transnational free movement of people and it goes on to add a few other things, but like just leaving it at that, which it was passed. If you're asking me for a definitive view, my definitive view is that is misguided.
Okay, but as far as whether so like look, just like really like just to try to make this as specific as humanly possible, right? Like let's say that there's a person who.
Are you saying that you agree with me that at least the language in that resolution was misguided, and you tweeted about it contemporaneously?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I have now I do. I do.
So, I mean, in establishing that, I mean, I think we've established that there is a strain of thought on the activist American left, which had influence within the Bernie orbit and the campaign that advocated this position.
So the question is how that influence was manifested, and if the way that the influence is manifested is saying.
But we at least have to come to an agreement that existed as a point of influence.
There are people who say silly things about immigration, borders.
But this just wasn't just random people. It was the DSA, which actually Bernie Sanders just endorsed as an organization that people should join in the aftermath of the campaign being suspended. I mean, I think, and you could, however you quantify it in terms of its influence, there's at least some relatively substantial degree of influence embodied by the DSA, and the DSA chose to do that at its national convention.
That's not a point in dispute.
Okay, good.
What interests me is when you say, okay, so if the end point of the process, right, is the way it manifests, is that Bernie is taking these positions. I'm not sure they did hurt him. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But that we should go back to the pre-1990s system by decriminalize border crossings. And we should, and also we should abolish ICE. Those both strike me as good things, at least as policy goals. That I think we should decriminalize border crossings. I think we should abolish ICE. And I know you expressed a little bit of ambiguity earlier, and sort of said, well, if it's not, at a certain point, wasn't even necessarily deporting people. At which point, that maybe is a minimal.
And the reason why I'm a little hesitant to offer you a definitive view on this is because if I were to do that, I would want to write an article of comparable length to this one, where I actually go through each precise detail, weigh a variety of considerations, try to postulate how various aspects of these proposals would work in practice. And it just doesn't sit right to me to say, okay, decriminalize all border crossings. Okay, then what comes up in its place? Am I opposed to it on principle? Not necessarily. But again, I don't like pigeonholing myself into these positions as a result of the advocacy of people like, for example, DSA and their allies in the media, of which there are many, who, come at it with this heavily moralizing and quasi-authoritative approach, where you're evil and fascistic or red brown or something, even if you raise apprehensions about this kind of thing.
Yeah. So maybe on a question, if it's okay to, like I said before we started, I turned into a pumpkin at 9, because I got to. Have dinner, but on a question, maybe you do have a more definitive position on, if it's okay.
Okay. Yeah.
So something that I think you have very clearly identified with is that Bernie Sanders wasn't your candidate in the first place, right? Like, you the person you were enthusiastic about was Tulsi Gabbard.
Well, I mean, I was enthusiastic about Tulsi Gabbard in the sense that I devoted my energies, journalistically and otherwise, into trying to present what I believe to be was a fair view of Tulsi as a candidate and sort of what she represented and how she was covered in the media, et cetera. So that was my kind of journalistic and analytical focus. And I've also am perfectly happy to admit that I had a personal affinity just in terms of her style, kind of her emphases. But at the same time, I was generally supportive of Bernie Sanders. I actually would have loved to have seen a Bernie Tulsi ticket. I thought they would have balanced each other out nicely. I thought her disposition would have made for a politically advantageous sort of counterweight in a way, just in terms of how you think about two people coming together on a ticket. Mm-hmm. But I wasn't endorsed. I like my personal endorsement wasn't really a factor, but I haven't tried to hide the fact that I do have a personal affinity for Tulsi, but I also support aspects of the Bernie project. I mean, I voted for Bernie in 2016. I defended him pretty rigorously in them. I've even defended him up until now, but the reason why I'm not really in a defensive mode vis-a-vis Bernie is because the project pretty clearly failed, despite many clear advantages that I think it had coming into the 2020 cycle. Therefore, it's sort of incumbent on people who do have a sympathy or an allegiance to the Bernie movement to like enter into a different analytical posture in terms of how they discuss it, if that's not too roundabout of an answer.
Okay, no, I think I got it. So, I guess I'm curious because some of the reasons that I would be more critical of Tulsi Gabbard are foreign policy positions that she took, like for example, right, like there was a time when it seemed like she was very critical of the Obama administration, not for any of the many excellent reasons that it would have been good to be critical of them, or maybe for some of those too, but because Obama didn't use the phrase radical Islamic terrorism.
Okay, see, that's a mischaracterization already, but go ahead.
Okay, all right. Well, all right. Maybe I'll finish up, and then you tell me what's mischaracterization.
And that was in 2015, so that was well before this campaign.
Okay, so you think that's like a relic of a previous position? She's evolved.
No, I'm just saying she has evolved in a way. I mean, she's definitely. I think her analysis sharpened, in particular, over the course of this 2020 campaign, to the point where toward the end she was offering, I thought, very incisive critiques, for example, of the Israeli occupation of Palestine, denouncing it at her campaign appearances and so forth, in I think actually in a more incisive way than even Bernie. And that's just one issue of many that I could name. But if you want to, I'm not saying you, but if one wants to insist on latching on to one stray comment that she made on TV in 2015, okay, fine. Her point at that juncture was that the Obama administration was obscuring the ways in which U.S. policy had actually exacerbated the, I think, real problem of Islamic extremism in the Middle East through its foreign policy, in particular the CIA program and the various related regime change initiatives in Syria, in the context of which genuinely radical Islamic elements end up getting arms and funding and oppressing non-Sunni Muslims in the region. So that, I think, is what her point was in making that one stray statement in 2015 that people endlessly latch on to.
Well, I mean, I think that one reason maybe that some people might latch on to it is that it seems like less of a stray, sort of unrepresentative statement when you start thinking about some other comments she's made over the years. Like I think she, maybe this is a mischaracterization too. Maybe you can tell me, but I know, for example, she says things like she has said things at least like. I'm a dove about regime change wars, but I'm a hawk about the war on terror. That certainly doesn't sound like anything good to me.
She didn't say hawk on the war on terror. She said hawk on terrorism. And one way in her mind to combat terrorism is to not fund radical Islamic terrorists and to not arm them in Syria. And that, given that was one of her legislative priorities in the precursor phase to her running in 2020, where she introduced, for example, the Stop Arming Terrorists Act as it related to Syria. So yeah, I mean, does she favor things like does she call for the abolition of all counterterrorism measures? No, she does not. But then again, neither does any political figure in the entire American political landscape, including Bernie Sanders. So I mean, I think, again, that was another quote of hers, which seemed like her, in particular, left-wing opponents just latched onto with, while at the same time refusing to put it into a broader context where they would give Bernie like all the charitability in the world in terms of contextualizing his positions, for example, like why he supported the Iraq Liberation Act in the 90s, which was itself a precursor to regime change in Iraq, and many other examples that I could potentially name. I don't think that discredited Bernie's foreign policy analysis overall, but it was something that, was potentially a blemish on his record, at least if you don't think that regime change facilitated by the U.S. in Iraq turned out particularly well. So again, that kind of, and they also ignore the many ways in which Tulsi singularly bucked foreign policy consensus, in particular over the course of her 2020 campaign, in ways that I actually do find heroic and courageous, and in ways that Bernie just never even touched. For example, being a cheerleader for Russiagate, being a cheerleader for Ukraine impeachment, and that sort of stuff, which Tulsi alone challenged.
Do you think that if he had taken a Tulsi-like position on Russiagate, that would have helped him in the Democratic primary?
I don't know one way or another, but I do know that catering to the segment of Democratic voters, which is a real segment for sure, who were very much exercised about Russiagate, was never going to redound to Bernie's benefit. Because if you're somebody who's like a diehard MSNBC viewer and you follow crazy Twitter threads connecting the dots about Russiagate, I don't think Bernie's ever going to be your natural candidate. So in making the rhetorical and in a sense substantive concessions to those people, part of what we argue in this piece is that it had the concomitant effect of alienating maybe the elements of the Democratic base which aren't emphasized on MSNBC or social media, but maybe aren't formed, at least in 2016, a significant portion of his coalition. I think that actually alienated him because it made him just seem more like a conventional Democrat. He repeated all the standard talking points about Russiagate, so therefore his novelty and his uniqueness wore off. Like, why is it that Bernie Sanders had to do like a hostage video style live stream about Ukraine impeachment where he's talking about this guy, Lev Parnas, who like the Rachel Maddow acolytes were flipping out about for a full week, and now nobody remembers what he did or what his role was in the Ukraine impeachment saga because it didn't mean anything, and yet Bernie makes rhetorical concessions to those people and not others within, broadly speaking, his coalition. And I think that did contribute to why the coalition atrophied.
So
I mean, what do you think? Do you think it was just swell for him to jump on board with every aspect of Russiagate? I mean, do you think Russiagate turned out well? Like, is it a proud moment in U.S. left liberal politics?
I've always been allergic to look. I don't. I've said in the past that you could put Ben Burgis, 1980 to whatever, didn't give a shit about Russia on my tombstone, but. I don't.
Well, I mean, I did give a shit about it in the sense that I thought it was important to analyze it critically.
I'm very familiar with that position. But the point is that he certainly wasn't speaking to me when he.
Who was he speaking to?
So I think I would make a distinction between saying that that there's anybody who's going to vote for him because of the Russia stuff. I agree. I think anybody who's obsessed with that, he's not going to be their natural candidate. But I think there's probably going to be a distinction between that and saying that he would have been well served by taking, your position on
I'm
Russia.
not saying he had to take my position in the sense that he had to do 20 tweets a day about how ridiculous various developments in the Russiagate quote unquote scandal were. But I think given that the campaign failed, maybe as a thought experiment, we could try to conceive of a Bernie who didn't give quote progressive left credence to the various ridiculous aspects of Russiagate, which he absolutely did. And in fact, it boomeranged on him ahead of the South Carolina primary, where Bernie, he got Russiagated 2.0 himself and then accepted the very premises of his own Russiagating. And I thought that was actually a shameful moment.
So I wonder, though, because whether if he had, even if he wasn't tweeting it 20 times a day, if he had said or indicated that, that there was no there, or even just that he'd, that like he just like resolutely didn't, never said anything about it one way or the other. If it's right to say that his taking a different approach boomeranged on him, or if him doing that would have actually made him much more vulnerable to that kind of hit job.
Well, he was vulnerable anyway. On the day before the Nevada caucus, leaks came out to the Washington Post, headlines blaring, Russia is supporting Bernie Sanders. Then he wins the Nevada caucus because it's dominated by left-wing activists, so that's sort of an exception. But then the following week, he has the final big debate. South Carolina turned out to be the most important primary, I would argue. Mm-hmm. Days before the South Carolina primary, people were tuning into the final debate, and he gets just blasted with this whole notion that Russia is supporting his candidacy, and he doesn't even contest it. He actually accepts the fallacious premises underlying an attack designed to destroy his campaign. Do you know who actually did contest the premises of that attack? Tulsi Gabbard did. And yet another reason why I am
horrible perfectly that she ended up feeling the need to say I'm not a Russian agent repeatedly on the debate stage, which I also thought was weird because it seemed like it put the idea in people's minds who hadn't heard it, but whatever. I think Hillary Clinton put the idea in people's minds, but yeah. I think just purely on a,
I'm saying this was months later when she actually defended Bernie against the, quasi Russiagating attacks that he was subjected to and did not even attempt to rebut.
I think, yes. I think he should have taken a stronger line on that. But I think that if he had been saying Tulsi-like things about Russia all along, I think that attack would have landed a lot more. I don't know. Maybe you have. I haven't seen any polling or other evidence that accusation was a big factor in what happened in South Carolina.
Well, in one of the pieces that I sent you, the Real Clear Politics piece, where I actually do get more into this sort of Bernie Russiagating thing. There's polling data you can find since 2016 which show that supermajorities of Democratic primary voters believe not just that Russia, quote, interfered in the election, but they actually hacked the voting machines, meaning they tampered with the vote tabulation and installed Trump in office. So if you're just going to let it go out in the ether that Russia is, oh my goodness, interfering in the election again, this time they're helping Bernie, and you have no ability to contest it, and then you express shock that Democratic primary voters react negatively to that, then maybe that's partially due to Bernie's own maybe mishandling of the issue, partially due to just how the Democratic primary electorate has shifted in terms of its sentiment since 2016. I don't know. But what I do know is that the 5-year-long Bernie project failed, and maybe it's worth at least entertaining that something could have been done differently on this because it blew up in his face at the worst possible time.
I'll entertain it, but I think to be persuaded by it, what I want to see, and again, if you have something like this in the piece that I just missed because I was reading through it looking for debate propositions, okay. Then
this is a separate. This is not the Nagel piece. This is a separate piece. Yeah.
So you just cited polling evidence that supermajorities of Democratic voters believe that Russian election interference in general is a problem, but I was wondering if there was
no. Supermajorities of Democrats, self-identified Democrats in the United States, believed not just that Russia, quote, interfered in the 2016 election, but that they basically installed Trump into office by tampering with the vote totals.
Right. So
that's a belief that's existent within the Democratic primary electorate. How do you think those voters react to news ahead of the South Carolina primary that Russia's back, surprise, and this time they're helping Bernie?
So my impression,
do you think that's a good or bad thing in terms of his electoral prospects?
But my impression at the time was that much like several other lines of attack that had been tried recently, like the conversation he supposedly had with Elizabeth Warren and, et cetera, that this one didn't really land very well.
Well, I mean, Bernie's own campaign operatives admitted that the Elizabeth Warren attack did land and hurt his favorability ratings among women Democratic primary voters. It didn't inhibit him from, losing narrowly in Iowa and then winning narrowly in New Hampshire and then winning resoundingly in Nevada, but it did diminish his favorability among women primary voters, and we mentioned that in the piece. So there are obviously in any election it's going to be multivariate.
Of course, but the question that I'm raising, right, is so maybe this so like I said, wasn't my impression at the time. Maybe this.
And by the way, I blame liberal media and also aspects of left media for granting credence and legitimacy to the Russiagate narrative writ large, such that it was even in a position to boomerang back on Bernie at a critical moment pre-South Carolina. So you can't entirely blame Bernie individually for not having almost the political resources available to him to contest that charge, because there were 4 of us who challenged it the entire time actively. Of course.
The question that I was raising is did it boomerang in a significant way? In other words, is there some sort of polling evidence that it was a factor for South Carolina?
But there were no polling. The polling question that theoretically would have had to have been asked is does this news of Bernie allegedly being helped by Russia make you more or less likely to vote for him? As far as I know, there was no such polling data, but that doesn't mean it didn't have an effect that you could discern using other empirical methods.
No, but it does mean that we don't.
I mean, for a lot of this stuff, it's impossible to draw a direct causal connection between a news event and voter behavior, right?
So forget the causal connection even. Do you know of any polls showing that the majority of voters in South Carolina or elsewhere believed that Bernie Sanders was a beneficiary of Russian interference?
I'm not aware of any polls that even asked the question, but I'm saying let's say 5% heard about 5% of pro voters heard the news, and it affected their opinion of Bernie in a negative direction. Even that is consequential, especially in a primary system where it's proportional allocation of delegates. Let's say 5% of just Massachusetts primary voters heard that and had a negative, and it caused them to have a more negative opinion of Bernie Sanders. He lost the Massachusetts primary, I forget the exact margin, but it was small, or Maine or something, right? So I mean, a lot of this is marginal stuff, sure, but you got when you take it in totality, I just think people have been a little bit too cavalier in dismissing it, especially just given how prime Democratic voters were to react with the utmost alarmism to any Russia-related news.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the obsession with Russia is was a way for centrist Democrats to avoid having to.
But given that the obsession exists, is it far-fetched to infer that it might have had a downstream effect on voter behavior, especially among highly engaged, informed Democratic primary voters who follow the news obsessively?
The reason that I'm not, maybe that's true. The reason I'm not persuaded of it is that we would have to, compare 2 possible effects, right? One is not just, if the question is not just okay, would it be better if this Russia obsession had never existed in the first place? But the question is, would it have been better if Bernie Sanders hadn't, taken the oath on it, right? Hadn't,
okay. Well, I mean, we could never know that with absolute certainty. That's just the inherent ambiguity of analyzing elections, which, as again, are multivariate phenomena. But we're talking about this because you mentioned Tulsi. I mean, would you agree with me that her position, insofar as you're familiar with it, on the Russia situation, and then impeachment, which was kind of like an offshoot of the Russia issue, do you think it was substantively superior to Bernie's position, forgetting the political ramifications?
Yeah, probably I do. I think that
great.
The stuff that again, I would be more concerned about with Tulsi would less be
But do you think that her staking out a position as a Democrat? I know a lot of people kind of miscast her as like being some kind of right-wing infiltrator, which she never was. She was a lifelong Democrat. So as a Democrat who's seeking the Democratic nomination, granted that she didn't have a huge platform, but like she challenged the Russian interference narratives. Would you see that as justifying, for example, me assigning her maybe a little bit more of my attentional energies than other candidates? I mean, or in other words, does her posture vis-a-vis that issue shed light for you in terms of why I have the attitude toward her that I do?
Sure. I mean, you're very concerned with that, so I could see that, right? They have. Okay. I think that. I think that we'd also want to separate out two different issues there, right? Which are three, maybe, right? Which are what's the sort of intrinsically right principled position on that? Did it? Was she doing herself any favors by holding it as far as how she did in the primaries? And would Bernie Sanders have been better off if he'd taken a similar position? And even granted we can't know with certainty, I do find it plausible that even outside of the people who are most obsessed with it, who watch MSNBC 18 hours a day and have charts in the background like Russ Cole and True Detective, trying to figure out that time is a flat circle, or the
It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia meme of the guy with the board.
Yeah, have the Always Sunny, that those people aren't voting for Bernie, but that there is a much wider portion of winnable people who take that stuff seriously enough that any sort of hint, right, that he wasn't on board with it, that would have been a serious liability for them. And I do find it plausible that there would be more of those people voting in Democratic primaries than people who are less likely to vote for him because he was saying the same things that everybody else was saying about Russia.
Well, okay, here's a way to frame the question. If we could run back the 2020 campaign in some parallel universe with the only variable changing that Bernie didn't embrace the Russia narrative. Not saying he outright rejected it or campaigned against it or made a point of emphasis, but just that he had more of a distance from it, that he didn't talk about it in the same exact way that like a Chuck Schumer talked about it. Do you think that's at least plausible in running back that experiment? Then perhaps, I don't know, 3% of the rural voters in Michigan or someplace else who abandoned him might not have abandoned him? Or like, would that be an experiment worth running?
I think I think it would be an
in this incredibly hypothetical scenario.
It's
impossible.
Experiment worth running if we could, if we could run it in different scenarios and we didn't have to actually gamble on that paying off. I think when it comes, I think certainly by the time the Michigan primary happened this time, I think the die was cast, right?
Well, it was, and the die was cast in the sense that his rural support had already eroded in the first four states. I mean, he narrowly lost Iowa, largely because Pete Buttigieg had organized the rural parts of the state and had prevailed there. And then the same was true in New Hampshire. I mean, his margin of victory was relatively small, in part because of his erosion of support in the rural areas. So the die was cast, sure, but maybe the die would have been rolled, and I don't know. The analogy is a little dicey, but yeah.
So do you think it's plausible that in that alternate universe where we run that, run it back with just that one change, that in that universe, accusations that that Bernie was a whatever useful idiot or worth of Russian interference would have had more purchase in the world where he was, where he was significantly cooler to that stuff, and that
but I just knew that
bigger problem than the 3% of rural voters.
I just think that those attacks would have had purchase regardless, as evidenced by the fact that he was Russiagated at a crucial moment. And the fact that, like, I don't know if you read the Mueller report. If you didn't, I don't blame you. But if I have, obviously, and there's a part in there where it lays out how allegedly in the 2016 primary campaign, Russia interfered on behalf of both Bernie and Trump with their, devious social media bots and such. So of course that was all going to get brought up again, and therefore there was enough ammunition to tarnish him by fallacious association with the Russian interference narrative to begin with. So yeah, I don't think it was necessarily electorally prudent for him to then give his imprimatur to the narrative, given that there was such a distinct possibility the whole way through that it was going to be used against him. And so, yeah, I do think, again, we can't run back this experiment, but I do think it's a question or a consideration that seems to get dismissed out of hand by a lot of people in a way. Partially because I think they don't spend, like, especially on the people on the left, partially because they don't spend a whole lot of time with, like, normie Democrats. Like, I spent all of 2017 when I was at the Young Turks, going to normie Democratic events, town halls and stuff, where Russiagate was just like an incredible obsession. It was disturbing. And so, like, I knew from firsthand experience that yes, that was going to have a downstream effect on on voter preferences. But again, that was a very activated segment of the Democratic coalition, not necessarily representative of the entirety of it. And I just think that there was overlap in the Bernie coalition from 2016, which made it such that it wasn't necessary for him to cater to those, liberal resistance activist types by telling them what they needed to hear on Russiagate, because they weren't going to vote for him anyway. So the blithe dismissal of it just seems curious to me, and I think it's reflective of the fact that left media, for the most part, was missing in action on Russiagate. I mean, you have a couple of scattered exceptions here and there, but the left liberals, because of their left wing, because of their fusionism that's in the title of the Angela Nagel piece, one aspect of it was they allowed, in adopting this left liberal framework, they said, okay, Russiagate is something we're willing to countenance. And what did it get them in the end?
I think so. Again, I think that it's one thing to say that the accusation was already out there enough that it would have had some purchase one way or the other. The part that I'm less persuaded of is that it wouldn't have had more purchase in this hypothetical than it did in this one. And then if it did, right, then the question is whether, this, 3% of rural voters you're postulated, right, whether it would have been such that overall, Bernie Sanders would have done himself more harm than good if he had been cooler on the Russia stuff. I'll also say in the defense of left media that at least the part of left media that I'm affiliated with, Jacobin, the editor Bhaskar Sankara, actually, I remember doing a debate about whether the left should be pursuing the Russian collusion stuff, and his position was no. So, for whatever that's worth, but I don't want to say that and just run. But
this is a side point, but like, to me, it's not sufficient to just say no. The left shouldn't pursue it, and I hate this, like. Whenever somebody says, like, we on the left must do X or the left should do X, I automatically roll my eyes, and, like, I hate that kind of framing of stuff, because, like, well,
there are clearly things you think the left shouldn't do, because you'll use the phrase the left to, like, criticize things that you think are counterproductive.
That's true. I should retract that. I mean, maybe it's irrational on my part, but, like, when somebody is starting a spiel with "we on the left must X," I just automatically kind of bristle. I guess.
I mean, I guess again, it should wrap up. I said I turned into a pumpkin at 9, and I don't want to make my wife mad at me, but we'll wrap up. But I mean, just very, very quickly on that point, I was going to say, like, to me, it was always inadequate for. I mean, I like Bhaskar, but to just say, we on the left need not preoccupy ourselves with this. Well, like, I mean, hey, guess what? Huge sections of the country are preoccupied with it, including sections that you
are going to have you want to be in an electoral alliance with in order to get your favorite candidate the Democratic Party nomination. Therefore, you're required to engage on it. It's not just it's not a matter of just saying, oh yeah, we shouldn't embrace it. You actually have to have an active position on it and be familiar with the details, because like just saying you're apathetic, it just doesn't work, because given the nature of the coalition that you think that you're entering into it in the electoral realm.
So I guess the two parts that I question there are, again, first, I think if you're going to say, I guess I don't understand how you could say that on the one hand that the left shouldn't do X, Y, and Z, and on the other hand that it's that it's like inherently bad and annoying to talk about what the left should do. But
I acknowledge there's a contradiction there. It wasn't a totally well-formed thought.
But on the more substantive point, I think, I guess I do wonder, I mean, the two, to the extent that I ever took a position on this, which was mostly just in like grumpy social media posts, I was fairly skeptical, but I also wonder whether it's, if you say, okay, the starting situation is that lots of Democratic voters are fixated on this, right? Then like the next question is it, if the question is a strategic one, then I guess my question is whether it's going to be a better strategy for countering that obsession to spend your time arguing with the main group of Russia obsessives about whether they're right about the particulars, or is it a better strategy for countering the obsession to just emphasize that there are other things that are more important?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an open question, and it would have got. I mean, again, to use this cliche that I wish I had a better term for, the devil would have been in the details in terms of how exactly he approached this more distant, let's say, attitude toward the Russia issue. Like, again, arguing with Russia obsessives on a daily basis, no, probably would have been a gainful strategy politically, but I think there might have been some kind of compromised position there. And Bernie didn't emphasize it over and over again, but he did, for example, like endorse impeachment purely on the grounds of the Mueller report. He did bring up proactively Russia in several debates. So I just don't know if that. And then we're also at a point where like he lost, so like sure, maybe some alternate viewpoints should be a little bit more
sure. And I think that just about anything that you could bring up for a possible reason why it's lost is at least worth considering, because one hopes that we're not just going to live in this hell world of Trump versus Biden style elections forever, that like maybe someday we can get a Bernie style candidate in which case there might be things to learn from all of this. But I would say that what considering it should amount to is critically looking at how much of a case there is there. And then I'd say that I could certainly see the argument that it didn't serve Bernie well to proactively bring it up at debates, but I wonder on the impeachment issue, separate from whether it was the right position in principle, which I'm not against talking about that, right? But like just as a question of electoral strategy, I do wonder if he had, for example, refused to support impeachment, and there's no way to, as you know better than anybody, there would have been no way to quietly take that position, right? That would have been something that would have been.
No, I mean Tulsi's vote of present on impeachment was a career-defining vote. And again, I think another very extremely courageous one, because she was motivated by the substance.
Okay. So if Bernie had taken a similar position, it seems to me that wouldn't have had the effect of reducing the extent to which Democratic voters cared about or were thinking about, Russia later. That would have been probably the dominant anti-Bernie talking point for the next year, that Bernie Sanders wasn't even willing to support impeachment.
Maybe so. Like, I'm not denying that it was I'm not denying that it was a difficult political quandary, and there's no easy answer. But given that he lost, maybe in some alternate universe, Bernie says, you know what? Look, this impeachment stuff is kind of the product of establishment preoccupations, and therefore I'm just going to abstain from it in some ways, similar to what Tulsi did, although he could have had his own spin on it. And maybe, I don't know. I mean, who knows, right? But I think it's at least worth thinking about.
Well, I think it's certainly worth. I think,
and given that we're dealing in counterfactuals here, if you're willing to concede that on the substance you believe Tulsi's position was superior, that is satisfactory to me. I'm willing to just sing hallelujah. And
okay, I still I think agree with Bernie on more things than I agree with Tulsi on. But
that's fine.
Maybe that could be a conversation for another time. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, you too. And this was an unstructured conversation. I mean, do you feel like we achieved something worthwhile here, or like?
I think that there was more. I think if nothing else, on some of the issues that were raised in the Twitter discussion, I think that where we agree and where we disagree, I think was at least clarified by this in a way that it wasn't earlier. So it's good that we did it.
I agree. And that guy Joshua Blanchard or whatever is going to be pleased. He tries to always facilitate these good faith dialogues with me from his perch from wherever he is. And when people accuse me online of never having productive conversation with people I may disagree with, I'm going to now have to include you as a rebuttal to that. And you're gonna be obligated to affirm it.
My blessing for doing so. Good conversation. Let's talk again sometime.
Okay, perfect. Enjoy your dinner.
All right. Thanks, Michael.
Take a bite for me. Okay, goodbye.
Thanks.